and welcome to Psychology of Salesforce. I'm Cole Fisher. My title is Strategic Solutions Lead at ListEngage, which basically just means that I get to geek out, especially on the sales and pre-sales side of things, on concepts like marketing cloud products and data cloud, even Agentforce and AI capabilities as they come up. I focus a lot on strategy, technical, and functional details, especially around implementation, product capabilities, and configuration, and things like that. And I'm especially passionate about customer behavior and the psychology behind all of these concepts. So that's what we get to dive into today. We'll focus on a few key concepts around behavioral economics and what they mean for Salesforce marketers. So just to lay the groundwork, first off, you're all crazy people, and that's okay because so am I, and your customers definitely are. I'll preface this with a few. If you let me just kind of geek out a little bit in the academic world and in the theoretical concepts, there's sort of a spectrum of view of what rationality is. So on one end, you have this neoclassical economics standpoint, kind of your textbook, supply and demand, diminished returns, what we all took in high school and college. And it basically has this prototype of a human, we'll call him Homo economicus, right? And everything to Homo economicus is perfectly rational, and he's fully informed and doesn't make mistakes based on these, pure textbook concepts. On the other end of the spectrum, we have sort of the psychology world, which basically says we're all crazy. We have emotions and habits and influences and distractions and all sorts of things that influence our decisions and impact our choices. And the prototype over here, instead of Homo economicus, is basically this more akin to Homer Simpson, if you will. Somewhere in the middle of this spectrum is kind of this, where theory and the practical world meet. And it's this world of behavioral economics. And it states that we're all bounded under, so we all operate under what's called bounded rationality. And it's our human nature to have limited bandwidth, limited resources, and limited information or access to information that we can either acquire or retain. So it's kind of this exciting blend of theories and principles and concepts that are widely applicable to nearly any field. That said, take with a grain of salt what you'll hear, because not everything will be directly applicable or universally true for all customers and subscribers. But it's meant to challenge what and how and why we think about and why we do things in a certain way. So, like I said, this is all empirically tested and valuable framework for how we think about people and their behavior and customers, and especially marketing. And certain components will be very relevant to marketing or customers, but it's all worth considering and testing, even if some of this may not be directly, true or quite one-to-one applicable to what you're doing today. So I'll highlight three broad concepts that I've found are especially relevant to marketers. And we'll dig into law of least effort, paradox of choice, and survivorship bias in more detail. So the framework with which we'll approach this is we'll take a general idea and discuss this overarching theory or principle or concept found in psychology and behavioral economics. We'll look then at instances of how this is pervasive in everyday marketing and consumer behavior. And then we'll talk about practical applications, how we either manage or leverage these concepts in marketing, or especially in Salesforce tools as we market. So first, we'll start with law of least effort. And basically what it states is we're all lazy. Daniel Kahneman, if you've ever read the book Thinking Fast and Slow, it's one of the best sellers. I think it's one of the top audiobooks of all time. He's basically one of the godfathers of the field of behavioral economics and a Nobel Prize winner. What he states in Thinking Fast and Slow, this book is there's basically a two-part system of how human beings process. There's high-level processing and low-level processing. High level is this abstract intentional, more strategic thinking that we do when we process the world around us. And our lower level processing is kind of this autonomic cruise control, walking, chewing bubblegum type of process that we don't have to put much effort into. And so in this lens, you can kind of liken cognitive bandwidth to currency. And so imagine you're in a store and you see two of the exact same product, exact same features, attributes, everything about it are the exact same, but two very different price points. Knowing that there's no quality or any other difference, you would never spend more to get the same thing. You would always take the lower price, obviously, right? You'd be silly not to. And Kahneman argues that this is true for non-monetary resources as well. So if we think of, that bandwidth as currency, our time, our energy, our attention, all of our resources become currency. And so we aim to get the most out of our spend, the most out of something while expending as little as possible. So what that means is, that's why we always tend towards the path of least resistance. So essentially your parents were right. You should get off the couch, get a job, because you're a good for nothing, lazy swindler. But we'll always tend towards the path of least resistance. And this was originally studied in the field of linguistics. And so what we always found over time was that as languages evolved, longer, more complex words and phrases habitually got phased out in favor of shorter, simpler phrases and monosyllabic words. And how the word monosyllabic is still in English language, I don't know. But anyways, that's why we basically abbreviate words. It's more efficient that way. So unfortunately for us, though, as marketers, our customers and subscribers are faced with this same sort of option of laziness. And so, for instance, an unengaged subscriber has two options. They can either unsubscribe, which all it would take would be a click, or visiting a profile center, not that much to ask. But if they're as lazy as I am, more often than not, they'll just disengage. And so you have unsub or unengaged, the latter of which is easier because it's one click less. And so, for us, there's almost this, as marketers, there's almost this irrationality to why we put so much effort into building preference centers when we know almost no one ever goes to them or even visits it once. It's a very slim minority that actually goes to a preference center or does anything there, especially when there's, upgrading subscriptions and, opt down instead of out and all this. And then I'm not bashing preference centers, as they're a very, important part, but we should probably do something that also caters to the other 95 to 99% of our subscribers as well. One of the things that we can be doing is progressive profiling. And so this is kind of marrying implicit as well as explicit data. Explicit being on a profile center, but implicit being things like Marketing Cloud personalization, where we can gather, browse behaviors or common attributes among products or content that they're looking at, where we can build profiles and affinities for what they're interested in, even though they're not stating anything to us. Along the lines of that explicit data, interactive email is something that I wish were being leveraged more frequently. Interactive email is a great way to make it easier on your subscriber with feedback surveys, post-purchase, profile updates, things like that, that I always kind of think about this as, how are we removing friction from the end user? If I send a follow-up or a post-purchase feedback or something like that, and I ask them to open the email, then click on this, and then open this website or this landing page, start to click there and then submit, that's a lot of friction. And knowing that we're all lazy, the odds of me as a consumer doing that, I know, are very slim. So I'm trying to market to the laziest version of myself that's possible. So if we could on interactive email forms where we can just keep all of the feedback short and succinct and just gather a few points, then we can move on and they don't need to come and visit. And we're removing that friction and allowing the customer to be lazy while still catering to them in the most effective way possible. And I want to make a point too, that I'm not bashing on laziness. It's okay for us to get lazy. In fact, I encourage you as marketers all of us just get lazy. A lot of us are already using things like Einstein features in Marketing Cloud, send time optimization, which goes back 90 days for behavior of opens and engagement. But if you want more than 90 days, which maybe you have longer sales cycles or things like that, it may make sense to you do your own custom modeling elsewhere and then bring those segments in. As well as there's also engagement frequency or scoring. And not to plug Agentforce or go outside of my lane here, but there's a lot of Salesforce tools that are really new and exciting if some of us have access to those. If not, there are loads of free external AI tools out there for content generation, image manipulation, things like that, that we could really be taking, half of our sort of menial workload off of our plates and really enjoying a little bit of being lazy. And last point is just being, speaking of being lazy, is make things easy. Again, kind of that removing friction concept for the end consumer. So how are we doing things like recurring or consumption-based concepts where, if there's replenishment or if they have seasonal purchases, things like that, that we could be taking advantage of, that we're just serving up on them based on behavior we've witnessed in the past, so they don't have to go and tell us when and how they need these. So if we can come up with models that help with that, fantastic. Our next concept is paradox of choice. And you've probably all heard of this. Marketers are commonly very aware of this conceptually, but it's still very counterintuitive for us to act upon this. And paradox of choice rears its ugly head in marketing and in sales and contact volumes and things like that. Think about, a lot of times we look at the volume of leads, and we look at it, it's like it's to be treasured, because the more leads we have, the more conversions we will ultimately have. The error in that thought process is that this assumes a constant rate of conversion, and that the quality is synonymous across a variety of different leads and lead sources. So if you've ever heard of paradox of choice in either a marketing or a psychology class, then you've probably likely heard of this study from more than 20 years ago now. But it's the sort of the quintessential paradox of choice study, where there was an experiment done in a grocery store, and it was the end cap aisles where they would display flavors of jam, of jarred jelly and whatever. And they would have originally, the control group had 6 flavors of jam, and they noticed the shoppers that went by, 40% of which stopped and looked at the display, and 30% of those actually grabbed one or more and put in their cart and checked out. So what they did was they added 18 flavors in the experiment group. What they saw was pretty, again, counterintuitive to what we'd expect. We saw 50% more shoppers get attracted to the end aisle. More impressions, more eyes were caught by this. But we saw the conversion rate plummet to 1/10 of what it originally was. And so there's a lesson to be learned here in terms of the simplicity and the fact that more is not always better. So there's an inverse relationship in talking cognitively. There's an inverse relationship between the amount of choices one has and the action that they're willing to take. So too much choice can motivate us to have sort of these counterproductive results. And there's a great book called Paradox of Choice by Barry Schwartz. And it dives in and empirically shows that there are 4 common outputs of paradox of choice. It's less satisfaction, cognitive dissonance, analysis paralysis, and lower conversions. And so just like in the jams, we see lower conversions, but also we see those that check out have less satisfaction. Because again, keeping that currency concept in mind, if I'm expending currency, decision-making bandwidth on buying a product or consuming a piece of content or whatever it may be, I expect, at least my 1-to-1 return, or hopefully as little spend and as much return as possible. However, when I have things, and this is, also kind of contradictorily true for us, is what we see in things like, 90-day money back guarantees and things like that. We typically don't see the money back guarantees used as much. We see it as possibly a lubricant to check out, but we also find is we'll see empirically lower CSAT scores because now we've left the gate open for more decision making to be made, more constant processing of, did I make the right decision? A lot of that cognitive dissonance comes into play here with, were there other options? There were so many other options to choose from. Did I make the wrong one? Now that I'm in the seat, I kind of wish I bought something else. And so if they do convert, we see lower satisfaction rates from that. So the reason this happens is twofold. First off, it happens because, keeping that finite bandwidth processing capability in mind, we experience decision fatigue, and our cognitive load can only handle so much. This is the reason that Steve Jobs would wear a black mock turtleneck and jeans every day, or Mark Zuckerberg would wear hoodies every day. What they believe they were doing, which there's a lot of data to support this, is that they were removing the low-level decision-making, thus freeing up more bandwidth for higher-level, more strategic thought processes. So it's really interesting. If we remove things that we shouldn't be paying attention to, we can focus on things or free up our bandwidth. The other reason that this occurs, paradox of choice, is because of loss aversion. And loss aversion is a very big overarching concept throughout psychology. But what it states is basically that the fear of losing something is more salient to us than the potential of gaining something of equal value. Now there's prospect theory and a lot of other things that can go into this, but this fear of loss, this loss aversion, is really powerful. And so what happens in our case of the jams, when we had 6 options, we had a 17% chance of getting the right choice, which, knowing my own personal preferences, what flavors I've experienced and not experienced, I'm likely able to navigate that just fine. So at 1 out of 6 chance, I like my odds of being able to convert and be happy with my selection. When we have 18 new flavors added, now assuming the same constant of one of these choices is right and the other ones are wrong, I now have a 96% chance of choosing incorrectly. And so as human beings, that loss aversion drives us to say, well, I would rather make no decision than the wrong decision. I don't want regret. I don't want remorse. I don't want that loss looming over me. I'll just make no action whatsoever. And so a lot of the times for us as marketers, we end up dealing with nothing. That is the output, is that there is no decision. And so a lot of the times we see this in, all over. Just think about a website where you see, or emails where you see recommendation logic that's serving up new content or new products. A lot of the times I've been in the shape where as a consumer, I'm going to purchase something and all of a sudden a product that's, a competing product or just looks just as good, but is a lower price point or something like that, makes me reconsider my actual checkout. And so I was on the path to conversion, but now there's too many recs. The recommendations don't consider what lifecycle stage I'm in. And instead of, a nice, clean, linear, progressing customer lifecycle, I'm actually regressing, or these recommendations, because there's so many of them, we're actually seeing that I'm being reminded as a potential customer that I don't have all the information to make this decision. I might regret it. Whereas if there were less recommendation, or if they were just complementary products or things like that, I'd be less likely to be deterred. I actually saw this with a customer when I was at Salesforce. When I was on the delivery side, we were playing around with recommendations and volume. What we would notice is more volume got tons of engagement, lots of clicks, longer time on site, but ultimately garnered fewer conversions, whereas less recommendations got them a little more to the point. And we steered a lot of that logic into, let's make sure that we're not competing against them, that the price points are different, or that we're doing add-ons rather than, or complementary products rather than, deterring them from checking out. Also think about our simplicity. Think about conversion, like what does a conversion look like in your message, your call to action. A lot of the times, especially in, I think in retail or anything dealing with memberships or anything like that, like, we know that the welcome journey or the initial lifecycle stage is going to be the most engaged time for that customer. So a lot of the times we make the mistake of inundating them with all sorts of messaging. Here's what to expect with the program. Here's our publication list. Here's, download our app. follow us on social, sign up for our SMS program. And we have all these messages that are competing. And remember, as the end consumer, in my eyes, I see an inverse relationship between the amount of choices, the amount of calls to action, and the actual action that I can take. Remember, we're lazy and we have this loss aversion. We're really playing with fire here if we're trying to get them to do something. So simpler, more succinct and concise and personalized messages are going to be a lot more effective. And the same holds true for audiences. We mentioned, lead generation concepts or the amount of volume of leads or things like that in the sales cycle. The same holds true for our audiences. The smaller, more targeted audiences, we always see, with very few exceptions, we'll almost always see greater conversions. And so think about, the exercise with the jellies in the grocery store. The larger the audiences, we saw more impressions, which means more cost, a lot more eyes on the product, but we saw significantly lower conversion. Remember, 10 times lower, 30% down to 3% conversions. And if you're in Salesforce Marketing Cloud or in Salesforce products, like those super messages can get pretty expensive. So you're gonna want to keep an eye on those. Our last concept is survivorship bias. And survivorship bias is, think of it as a logic-based error where we focus all of our attention on a subset of the data or subjects that pass a certain selection process while overlooking information that didn't necessarily make it past the filter, if you will, make it into our consideration set. And so what this looks like is there's a story, allegedly true. I've heard people claim either way, but during World War II, the Navy wanted to understand more about like the Allied pilots and how to protect them, how to not lose planes, how to make sure that the pilots were coming back safely. And so they asked themselves, well, how do we reinforce our planes, to stand up better against enemy fire? So they gathered all the planes that had run missions, all of that had returned from any sort of missions, and they collected data where they could find any enemy fire and where they had incurred the most damage. So the parts that were most decimated by enemy fire were the parts like wingtips, the central body, the elevators in the rear of the plane. And so the initial notion was, well, this is where we're incurring the most of the fire. It must be the easiest to hit or whatever. Let's make sure we're reinforcing these and keeping our pilots safe. And at that moment, a statistician named Abraham Wald stepped in and said, actually, we're only viewing a subset of what we need to view here. We're missing a big part of the data, and what we need to be focusing on is our nose, engines, and the mid to rear body of the plane. That's going to be the most important part. And what the Navy thought that they were assessing was the most common damage to planes, when actually they were assessing, where they could incur the most damage without the plane actually going down, as their data set was limited to all the surviving planes. The data they didn't have, the most imperative data, most critical to what they were trying to do here, as Wald pointed out, was that the data they were missing were the planes that never returned. And likely so, those planes would probably show enemy fire in very different areas than what we see in this diagram here. So the concept is basically that there's a lot of misinterpretation in data in general. Little known fact, there are 87% of statistics are completely made up. That's true. You can Google that. But more often than not, even on small insignificant levels, we come with this preconceived notion that I have a theory, and how can the data fit this theory? And is it factual? When actually we should be taking an unbiased look at the data and saying, what are all the possible theories that could fit this data? And there's a reason why we call this statistics and not facts, because we always have a sample, not the entire population. And so we don't have direct representation. And a lot of times, it's beneficial just to get an outside perspective. So whether that's, an outside consultant, or whether that's somebody who's, on the team next to you, or adjacent product or project or something like that, that's not inundated with your day-to-day, get them to look at this, get a fresh pair of eyes, and don't lead them into anything. Give them let them have a fresh perspective without any sort of leading the witness, telling them what you think the data means or what they're looking for. Just have them look at it and take an unbiased approach. So a lot of the times that'll actually shed light on something that we're not considering, or at least give us a different perspective that, maybe explains, a detail that we're not actually, keeping in set right now. So a lot of the reason this happens is because of framing. Basically, this is being positioned or told to us on what we, want the data to mean, or what we think it means, or we're being told how we should interpret the data. Also, again, to harken back to our laziness, we're lazy and we're routined, and we leverage biases and heuristics and cognitive shortcuts, and we just prefer simple models. We prefer, even if it's a partial data set, we never have complete data, and we prefer a simple explanation rather than really diving in and activating that higher level strategic thinking on every seemingly, mundane day-to-day task. And I'm not saying that we should wait for necessarily all the data, because you'll never have all the data. Just be aware that you have a preponderance of the data, and you have to use that sort of subset of data to the best of your ability. And so a lot of the times we see this in action with, lookalike audiences, where product X, has a certain demographic, and we find that all the time that, this is our key demographic. That might actually harken more to where we're getting our leads, where we're picking up business, or where we're investing most on the sales or pre-sales side. It could be that there could be a lot more here, but this is the data that we have. I noticed this a lot in when I was at Salesforce. I used to get a lot of deliverability issues would kind of come across my desk, and they would say, "Hey, we've been blacklisted. We need help. We need to reach out to the ISPs, get some, mediation here on deliverability. It's tanking, whatever it might be." And more often than not, we would zoom out and we'd say, are we treating the symptom, or are we treating the root cause here? Like, we're seeing the symptom of deliverability, but if we look upstream, is there something wrong with our lead generation, our tactics, where these are coming from? Maybe there's bot traffic. We've definitely had that, where we had bot traffic and unverified emails and things like that coming in, and that's our problem, not the subset of the output of the data that we were looking at. And so this is also true for attribution. I have a friend that says, multi-touch attribution is a pipe dream. There's some truth to that. Attribution is a goal for all of us, but the reason we always have a hard time kind of keeping a good thumb on the pulse of what attribution is because it assumes static preferences, affinities, equal weighting, and impacts for different types of customers across different parts of the life cycle. And so our KPIs, impressions, tracking, dwell time, things like that may actually benefit a lot if we take other views for consideration, Marketing Cloud personalization. We take some of their analytics and layer that onto our current analytics. Maybe we can get more of an impression of what some of these KPIs mean and what are really valuable. My last bit of advice would just be kind of get comfortable being uncomfortable. Don't be afraid to push, prune, test, optimize, experiment, and just, add new coefficients to the model, get an outside view. I used to have a professor that would always say, torture the data, they will confess. And so whatever you do, just kind of slice and dice the data in whatever you can, and find out if there might be a bias that we're taking in our approach here. So key takeaways really fast. I know we're running out of time. What I hope you learned is law of least effort, progressive profiling, native functionality and interactive emails, especially around some of our preference center practices and how we can gather implicit versus explicit data. Paradox of choice, more is not always better. Make sure you're experimenting with the volume and logic of recommendations, that we're not competing with our own messaging and getting out of our way with convoluted CTAs and competing messages. And then lastly, survivorship bias that we just covered. Just take an unbiased approach to our data and audience considerations, what our segments should look like, and challenge what the data tells us, whether we're diagnosing symptoms or a root problem or a root cause of the problem. Don't be afraid to consult someone outside of your work area or office or team or whatever. Think about who our customer types are, if higher engagement is really better odds of conversion, or if we're finding out that window shoppers are just very different shoppers than impulse buyers. There were a couple other concepts I would love to touch on. We're all running out of time. So thank you all for being here. If you have questions, comments, feedback, I'd love to connect. If you have any, if you're even a fraction as excited as I am about these